everyone. I'm Akela. I'm the head of customer success engineering at Rasa, and I'm here today with Angel from Telekom, who's been working on bots for a while now, and he's going to tell us a bit about his experiences there. So Angel, could you introduce yourself and some of the work you're doing?
Sure. Thank you, Akela. Right. My name is Angel. I'm working as a senior software engineer at Deutsche Telekom for over 2 years now. And ever since I started, we started working with Rasa right out the gate. So it was a very different Rasa than nowadays. But yeah, so that just shows us how much they've actually grown in these last 2 years. Our main projects concern bots, of course, in the area of service support and ticketing and all these use cases that are also familiar with this kind of companies. And so far, we have a very interesting journey, which I'm very excited to share with you.
Amazing. Yeah, nice. And so, I mean, could you talk a bit about what that journey looked like since now I know you have a lot of different bots.
Right. So, well, maybe from the beginning, when I started working with Rasa to the beginning 2018. Well, before I've seen the release from the core, and but for personal projects. So when I just joined, I thought like, okay, then it seemed that this whole chatbot had a second wave of resurgence. So everybody wanted suddenly a chatbot, same like with 2015. But the difference was that just so many painful lessons that needed to be learned, particularly with regards of the conversational design and all these things that people just give for granted and turn out to be a major, very impactful for customers, or for, in this case, end customers. The fact that Rasa was open source allowed us to start hacking away with it immediately. So back then there was 2 modules, NLU and core, and implement very useful benchmarks in terms of the NLU to see first to evaluate with the current vendors who were working as well, and see what would a self-developed chatbot or chatbot platform would look like.
Nice, awesome. That's super interesting. And so, I mean, you like you said, you have a bunch of different bots, and I'm sure there's different teams working on these bots. So from your experience, what does like a typical team setup look like for building a bot?
That's a very good question. So it was, I think, like, to be completely honest, at the beginning, it was an open question. And at the current status back then from Rasa, I think that the profile somehow differs from, or the ideal team profile differs widely from nowadays. So back in that time, we didn't have Rasa X, we didn't have like a lot of things set in stone in terms of the best practices, and a lot was all around the area. So there was a lot of the need for very software oriented, very hands-on people. So I would say that mostly software engineers in terms of like Python developers and so on. Back then there weren't, or it was a little bit harder to connect with custom channels. So front-end designers, of course, for the REST channel would be necessary. And something that we fortunately took on very early on in the process was including UX designers, until later on we become like conversational UX designers. And nowadays would be more like the software engineering, a little bit less just for custom actions, and much more reliance on customer conversational designers, sorry.
Right. And so these conversational designers, they're just, I mean, they obviously design conversations, but they're there to kind of ensure, I guess, the user has a good experience as well, right?
Right. So one of the big advantages that we saw using Rasa is that we got like the output all the way through the pipeline. So we could see exactly at which moment in time, not only from the technical perspective of the NLU, recognizing intents and entities, but also from the core and the dialogue manager, exactly what was going wrong in the conversation, and more importantly, how to quickly fix it and to adapt it. So previously, I personally had experience with other platforms, which sort of makes it everything easy at the beginning, like connecting bugs is supposed to be very intuitive.
Yeah.
But at the cost or at the expense of the end user, which in the end is probably not going to use that the bot you intended to, and that's, of course, it seems very intuitive in retrospective, but in hindsight, it's also, you have to learn that lesson sometimes the hard way. And that's why where conversational designers came, and not only providing out of the gate like their experience in terms of human interaction, goes a lot into psychology and human behavior,
Right.
but also how to adapt and how to reinforce the paths that based on data and usage and logs, how they needed a tweak, or the stories or the dialogue conversations that would have more attention, how to make them more like optimized to enhance experience, or even separate them in some cases. So if we notice that there were two different actions already abstracted into or crammed into a single conversation, all these little details that I mean, it would take like an hour to explain all of them, but yes, so that's why yeah, in retrospective, that's where the most value should go.
Right. So in essence, you kind of also try to learn from your users and how to yeah, how the bot should behave in certain situations.
Yes, absolutely, and it's also a great place to get sort of informal on your requests. So the easiest way is noting a conversation with went sideways because that particular functionality was either not offered, or we didn't account for that kind of experience, or that kind of triggering points. So we early on learned really quickly of how the actual user was using the bot, and not trying to set something and then train the user, and then by that time also reducing the customer experience. So one very little detail could be that because of the previous wave of chatbots, then users sort of got trained or badly trained to use keywords and no longer communicating to a
Right.
natural language interface. So they got sort of like a experience that if you don't explicitly say the keyword, it's not going to recognize your intent. So you should just talk like if you would be pushing buttons in the IVR system. That kind of curve learning, once you deploy one bot and tell them like, well, actually it sort of gets a little bit more natural conversation. So you could explicitly send more details, or put into your natural way that you would explain to another person, to another human being. And that got us a very long way. It's like this constant interaction, tightly coupled, was what eventually got us to a better customer experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Cool. And so, yeah, so you mentioned some, yeah, you mentioned software engineers and conversational designers. Is there like any other roles you have in these teams specific to training data, for example, or how is that whole
right
managed?
Right. So the one common pitfall we even fall ourselves for was the fact that we started with immediately with data scientists, and we thought that okay, we need the latest machine learning engineers and experts because those are the only ones capable of building an NLU. And then we saw that there were prefabricated recipes or pipeline coming out of the box with Rasa, and that were pretty performant, were pretty good. So on their own, so it was kind of hard to beat them unless there was very user specific or something. It was very easy to enhance them and to make them even better, but
Yeah.
like to get the bang for your buck in terms of those profiles, that was a little bit hard, right? So the so-called return on investment on data science and machine learning, that was harder at the beginning. But having said that, once you get to like once you invest initially in the experience, then you're gonna get more use cases, and those use cases at some point the amount of information input functionality becomes all too much, and then you need these kind of profiles where they can take data as a whole or big chunks of information and then optimize them in the best possible ways, and you don't need to go like a regular traditional workflow of a conversational designer conversation per conversation. So they just go in a bulk. Okay, what is going right, what is going well, boop, boop, and that kind of optimization process fits really well once bot reaches sort of a critical state. I would say so.
Got it. Yeah. No, that's definitely an interesting learning that for training data, you don't actually need the data scientists always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of shooting myself in the foot, right? Because I come from that field, and going around like, not necessary. That's kind of, it might be interpreted elsewhere. And don't take me wrong, they're very useful along the way. But even if you put a data science to design conversations, might not be the best use of their time. So that's what I'm trying to say.
That makes sense. Yeah. Awesome. And so, yeah, I mean, with all these learnings and so on, what are the like biggest things you're working on going forward now?
Well, there are a couple of so from the perspective or the customer experience perspective, there's always more features, more use cases, seamless integration with different channels, which is all interesting on its own part. But I'm particularly interested in the once it reaches a critical state, but how to optimize it and how to incorporate state-of-the-art findings from academia and other research institutions. So, so how to, for example, objectively or to some extent objectively assess the impact, or how well conversation is designed is a very, in my opinion, like an open question and a very interesting one. There's a lot of research from even companies that they're taking several approaches, all very interesting. From our side, we've taken also a different approach. So, well, not particularly different, but our own approach of sort of designing a framework of metrics and indicators that sort of steer us in that particular way. So we're not saying that we cracked the problem or anything. It's just that I guess that the better or the better approach we found was not just trying to blindly incorporate what everybody else was saying, but seeing from our grassroots projects what were the signals or the indicators that we could take on, and once we sort of knew our user base and our use cases, how could we incorporate those together, and how to accurately measure some sort of relevance, and more importantly, how to tie those metrics to the business side, right? To the business use case, to come to the business owner, to the stakeholders, and tell them, look, the bot is performing well because this and this and that, and that directly reflects because of this and this and that. That's kind of the goal in this whole evaluation.
Right. And based on these like evaluations, ideally, then you'd be able to kind of adjust certain things. And
yes. A very like particular one thing that pops into my mind, that's something that was almost empirically discovered while checking these the logs and by working with these bots in and out, was that there is a very nice analogy, or very well projection between the so-called exploitation versus exploration dilemma in data science. And that ties in really well with, for example, the policies that Rasa offers. So the statistical model encompassing this kind of, I don't know, TED embedding policy, or all these policies that uses this statistical model, can be seen as the exploratory part, and the memorization as the exploitation. So once you get some sort of knowledge, you kind of compare them with the things that you already know, you already program your bots to do, or you already teach, to use the word loosely. And having some sort of comparison between the ratio when one policy overrides the other gives you very good indicator of how much your body is performing, right? And it might be, there's no right answer. There's not like, okay, I have, let's say 30% of the time is using the memorization. That doesn't mean that I don't know what I'm programming. That just means that maybe you want that for a chit chat bot, a little bit more open.
Yeah.
And conversely, you can say like, okay, for very tight use cases, like in financial sector, you really need the business logic to override in most cases to have this congruence and this consistency that's much more important. So adjusting this little knob, this little trade-off takes you a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely differs a lot from use case to use case. So thank you for sharing all these insights, Akela. That was definitely really interesting. To everyone that is watching, we are doing a live Q&A after this. So if you have any questions, then please join us there. Yeah, thank you, Akela.
Thank you, Akela. My pleasure.